If you enjoy this video, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. And as always, a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting the channel. Howl's Moving Castle has always been a movie that I've heard people talk about forever. And because it's something that people hold so near and dear to their hearts, I wanted to put in a bit of extra effort and take the time to read the book by Diana Wynne Jones before I actually watched the movie. Which left me with some questions, as the book and the film are like different properties that use the same characters. The story hits some of the same beats along the way, but the path that they follow are so drastically separate at the same time. In Jones's book, the war is at best a background concept. In fact, they barely even mention it at all, whereas in the movie, the war is a set piece that drives much of the story, that wears away at Howl's soul and leaves him deformed. The book talks a lot about Sophie's sisters and their love lives. Markle is actually named Michael and is older, ending up with one of Sophie's sisters, Martha, who doesn't appear in the movie at all. There's no time travel in the original, Turnip Head is scary as hell, two of the main antagonists are combined into one person, Howl is way more of a fuckboy, and someone is trying to use him as the last part of their Frankenstein monster-like experiment. And this is the short version. If you're interested, I'm sure there are literally dozens of videos comparing the two on YouTube, but suffice it to say that after the halfway point of the movie, they're essentially entirely different stories. And this kind of struck me as pretty interesting, because it raises the obvious question of why even use the book as a foundation if the plan is to deviate in such a dramatic way. Well, that's because, while on the surface, these stories are almost unrelated. In reality, the themes and spirit of Jones's book are fully alive in Miyazaki's movie. In an interview with Diana Wynne Jones, she describes the core themes of her book being that, quote, "If you love someone enough, all sorts of extraordinary other things will happen in your surroundings as well, and you can achieve great things, even if the world around you falls to pieces." And there's this kind of idea that love is something that opens you up to adventure and possibility, while in contrast, hate would be something that seals you off from it. And Sophie in the movie is a pretty perfect example of this. Meeting Howl allows her to experience more magic. She can quite literally walk on air when he's around, and when she wanders off into the wastes, it's Howl's castle and Calcifer, who has Howl's heart, that really start her on her journey of growth. The romance between Howl and Sophie is one which is inherently surrounded by extraordinary things like Jones mentions. I think, though, that the more compelling parallel between the book and the film is this idea of children not wanting to grow up and being forced to do so by the world around them. Jones describes the origins of Sophie's character as something that stemmed from her own life. She had apparently developed a severe dairy allergy in 1984, which led to her almost losing the use of her legs and causing her to need a cane. She said that she felt like her youth was being taken from her, and she had suddenly become an old woman. Something that definitely translates into Sophie, with the book that would release only 2 years later. Sophie in the movie is a young girl who works at a hat shop. She crosses paths with some soldiers who start catcalling her, and Howl steps in to get her away. Now, of course, Howl is the one who's flirting with her in the books, but all the same, the Witch of the Waste becomes jealous of her and curses Sophie to become an old woman, cane and all. And this is something we'll come back to in a little bit. But Sophie is far from the only character that exhibits this trait. In fact, almost every character offers some spin on this theme. Markle is a child working for Howl who needs to pretend to be an elderly man to deal with Howl's visitors. Calcifer is a flame that's clinging to his existence, trying not to burn out. The Witch of the Waste tries to hide her age, but ends up being shown to be what she really is, and is forced back into being an old woman. And as you might expect based on the title of the story, there's one character that demonstrates the themes of the show more directly than others. Howl is a character stuck in his adolescence despite being well into his 20s. He's obsessed with his looks, and is kind of a fuckboy, especially in the book. However, as we see in the movie, he's drafted into both sides of the war, causing him to mentally and physically become different from who he was. Aging, at first, is seen to be something that's very negative and a terrible experience. I mean, just look at what the adults in the story have to offer. The Witch of the Waste, the soldiers catcalling Sophie, Sophie's mother who lies about visiting her to spy on Howl, Madame Solomon. There are just about no positive adult figures in the entire story, and Miyazaki specifically doubles down on this by portraying the influence that the older generation have on the young. They draft Howl and countless others into the war to fight for them until they lose all semblance of their humanity. And then we have Sophie's Curse, which is the embodiment of the older generation being jealous and spiteful towards the young. Beyond that, even when Sophie approaches the witch to have that curse undone, she's told that the witch doesn't know how to undo the curse that she left on her. A pretty clear line for the burden left on future generations in terms of things like the economy, social situations, the environment, the relationship between nations, and everything else they leave behind. Things that Miyazaki loves to bring up in his movies. It's often the case that things are left a mess, the young are left scarred and beaten down, and the old have no interest or no way of fixing their wrongs. And this is the curse left on the younger generation that forces them to grow up and face the world. And if we're talking about these kind of curses, then Miyazaki, much more so than most average people, knows one that leaves an impact unlike any other. Miyazaki was born in 1941, not even a year after Japan joined the Second World War. He notes that one of his earliest memories are of, quote, bombed-out cities, and at 3 years old, his family was even evacuated from Utsunomiya before it was bombed in 1945, an attack which killed 628 people, injured over 1,000, and left nearly 50,000 people homeless, not to mention that half the city was destroyed. This is one of the first things that Miyazaki can remember. It's a core part of where he comes from as a person, and it shows in so many of his movies. Nausicaa, Castle in the Sky, Grave of the Fireflies, and a good chunk of the rest all kind of carry this theme of war and its impact throughout them. And Howl's Moving Castle is no different. A war between two nations over a lost prince, and what's crazy is that the war effort is celebrated in the streets. Hundreds of people cheering and partying for a conflict that has nothing to do with them. And despite their jubilance, how many of them would die? How many of them would give up their humanity, their youth, or their lives for the whims of royal families or the previous generation? How many towns or cities would be wiped out like Utsunomiya? As always, to Miyazaki, war is never the option, and fighting will never lead to peace. And all of this is so much more important when you consider timing. Just as the book was written by Diana Wynne Jones as she was going through medical complications that led her to feel like her youth was being taken, the movie was also being created at a very influential time. In September of 2001, the Twin Towers fell. And that was the same month that Studio Ghibli announced that it was entering production of Howl's Moving Castle. And as a point of how much this upcoming war was going to affect Miyazaki, when Spirited Away would go on to win an Oscar in 2003, Miyazaki refused to fly to America, saying, "The reason I wasn't here for the Academy Award was because I didn't want to visit a country that was bombing Iraq. At the time, my producer shut me up and did not allow me to say that, but I don't see him around today." By the way, my producer also shared in that feeling. It's crystal clear that the Iraq War was a pretty big influence on the creation and production of Miyazaki's movie, and that inspiration is just something that wasn't there in the original. There is, without a doubt, a massive division between the story told in the movie and the original source material. Like I said, it seemed so strange at first that there was this decision to adapt it into a movie and then take so many liberties with the story. But despite them being so different, the meaning behind them remained the same. This idea that youth was being taken from people by means outside their control. Miyazaki combined the core themes of the book with current world events that he felt deeply passionate about, all while making use of this new medium through beautifully animated scenes that help illustrate the emotions, themes, and message of both the book and the film, which is likely why Diana Wynne Jones thought of the film as something amazing and beautiful, rather than a bastardization of her own work. She even left the movie thinking that Miyazaki, quote, understood her books in a way that no one else had ever done. So maybe the reason that this adaptation is so beloved is because unlike other failed adaptations like Percy Jackson, Death Note, and so many others, this movie took the soul of its source into consideration. The things that Diana Wynne Jones cared about are things that Miyazaki poured his soul into. They weren't taken and disregarded, They were taken and given a new perspective which allowed them to shine and reach more people in the modern climate. So the answer to the question of whether Miyazaki stole Howl's Moving Castle and transformed it into something else is an undeniable yes. However, it's through that transformation that the story was successfully modernized and given meaning that would be relevant to the entire world. It is not a one-to-one retelling of the book, but it's exactly for that reason that I think that Howl's Moving Castle ended up as something so beautiful and so important to so many people.